Libertarianism is pro-immigration, pro-market, pro-trade.
More competitive, less centralized. Not military confrontations, but peaceful interaction.
The war on drugs has been actually an unmitigated disaster.
And is there a glass of water?
Oh yeah, sure, I'm on that. So, but you want to entertain some questions, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so why don't we open up for questions and I'll go find a bottle of water.
Okay, great.
I'll be right back.
There's already there.
Oh, okay.
Yes, sir, there's an I'll come to you, sure.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Appreciate everything you said. One question I have is, being a journalist in the Islamic world, and we're even seeing journalists in the Western world, especially in the United States, not being respected much for their opinions or their writing. That's kind of gone down for a while. So speaking on topics of theology as a journalist, rather than being like an imam or some scholar, I'm not sure who are the people of influence, I guess, within the Islamic world that would be moderating voices, and how do you fit into that compared to others that what kind of weight do you have compared to them in kind of promoting this?
Sure. That's a great question, sir. Thank you. Well, I don't claim any religious authority. I'm not an imam. I'm not a sheikh. I'm not trained in the classical medicine system, so I'm not giving a fatwa, which is what there are people who do that. But I do refer to people who have that authority. And I find their writing, sometimes today, sometimes buried in a medieval text. And I say, hey, we have this great idea from this imam. Let's hear this more. So I'm trying to be a kind of public intellectual figure. And I think that is needed because today in the Muslim world, it's not just about having clerics issuing some legal opinions. It's about changing of a mindset. And that needs persuasion. That needs a conversation about why we need to rethink these issues. And also there are all kinds of clerics. Like somebody can find the other guy who's very intolerant. And I'm saying, well, listen, there was that, and then there's this. And ultimately there are authoritative texts like the Quran, and of course, and so every Muslim can refer to those. So I'm not claiming any religious authority. I'm just trying to be a popular writer in the Muslim world who is going to appeal to masses and give them some ideas and ask them to rethink and show them some solutions to our problems in the Muslim world. And I don't always speak about theology. I criticize conspiratorial thinking. I criticize the idea that we are under attack, so it should always make us defensive. No, we should. I speak about this need for self-criticism and things like that. So, and there are other people who are trying to do this. And I think the role of the public intellectual has become actually more important in Islam with the modern era because of the coming of the media. I mean, the first Ottoman reformers were journalists in the sense that they were writing essays in newspapers, and they influenced more people than the typical imam of yours. So that's what I am trying to do, honestly. And I write it, and whoever reads it in different parts of the Muslim world, it goes. And I'm not claiming to be a Martin Luther or anybody who's going to have a historic change. But I personally, if you ask me, trying to put some ideas out there so some people can think about these things. So that's. But I'm not an imam or cleric. Yes.
Yeah. Thanks. Thank you for that. I come from Kenya, and I was in Kenya in May and June. And I went to Westgate where there was bombing, and this conversation took place about connection of Islam and terrorism. And I'm a strong believer that there's really no connection. And I preached about it and talked. I teach the first classes here at the start about embracing there's no real connection between that. But the other day, very close to where I stayed in Westlands in Nairobi, there was another body. And somebody who was in the conversation, in the dinner conversation that we had, when I was saying there's no connection between terrorism and the religion of Islam, called me and said, Professor, you're wrong. The only common factor of the people who bombed Desert Hotel the other day, Westgate, and any other bombings is Islam. I struggle to treat. No, it's not. Well, tell me any other factor. And this time, it was not just the Arabic people, Somalis, now it has spread to other groups in Kenya, but all of them were Muslims. And I struggled hard to say, no, there's no connection. But I found my argument very weak. Because the only common factor of all those people, if you look at the names, they sent me, text me the individuals that they knew who had done the damage. You know, many people died. Just the other day, this year, in Nairobi. A few years ago, in Washington, the same thing. The one common factor was Islam. In other words, there could be anything else. And I'm just struggling to say, no, you cannot equate religion and terrorism. There's no connection. But they say, Professor, I think you're being naive. There's no other factor we see here except Islam. So even here when I teach, and that comes up in the classes, my diversity classes, that comes up. How do I fight it to say there's no connection? When the evidence, when the fact may show otherwise.
Okay, well, that's a good question. And it is true that you cannot equate that with Islam. That's obviously, that's so clear. But I will not tell you that there is zero connection. Because those groups, terrorists who act in the name of Islam, and that would begin with ISIS and Al-Qaeda and include various groups in the Middle East, Hamas, and Hezbollah, you can add that, and Al-Shabaab, and they're the worst. I mean, Boko Haram. They are referring to Islamic concepts. They are referring to the Islamic concept of jihad. They're just making a radical interpretation of that that is not shared by the majority of Muslims. So it's not that they're not connected. I mean, did the Crusaders have something to do with Christianity? Right. They did. But luckily, not all Christians think like that. And luckily, they're gone, but we have the Crusaders of the Muslim world today. So that will be the analogy. They're declaring jihad, right? And what is jihad? Jihad is Arabic word, which means struggle. It can be a spiritual struggle. It can be this and that, but it can be a military struggle. In the history of Islam, when you said, I'm declaring jihad, it means come and fight in the name of God. But in classical Islamic jurisprudence, jihad never meant attacking non-combatants. Jihad was fought between the armies. Like Salah ad-Din declared jihad against the Crusaders. What happened? There was a great battle, the Battle of Hattin, and Crusader army and Muslim army fought, and Muslims fought and won. And you were fighting another army. Ottomans declared jihad. They went all the way to Vienna, and they were fighting the Viennese army. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian army, Austrian armies. What happened in the past 4 decades, since the 70s, is that these groups emerged which said, well, those battles are gone. We can't fight big armies. We can hit their weak spots, which is their civilians. And they started to justify this with some fatwa, or fitwa. But the majority of scholars said, no, you can't do this, because in classical Islamic jurisprudence, and I do think a lot of things need to be changed, in jurisprudence. But the good thing is that there are clear commandments against attacking non-combatants. There's a hadith, a saying of Prophet Muhammad, which says, fight in the name of God, but do not attack the women, the children, the elderly, the monks. Do not cut down trees. There's a famous, so it's there and it's really stopped. So there was an idea of a war with morals. I mean, medieval Muslim scholars discussed whether catapults are halal or not. I mean, usable, permissible. Catapults are, throwing rocks. Some permitted it, but most of them didn't permit, because in the city, besieged city, if you throw a rock, there will be women and children. It's haram to kill them. So there were considerations like that. The kind of ultra-radical jihadists we've seen in the past 4 decades, they basically borrowed techniques from Marxist groups or or Tamil Tigers. I mean, Tamil Tigers are the ones who invented suicide bombing, for example. They understood that technique-wise, these are efficient because you can't fight the U.S. military and hope to defeat it, right? They thought, okay, this is the guerrilla way. Not even guerrilla, but guerrilla would be hit and run on the military. Right. They started attacking. So they justify this, but the majority Sunni and Shia scholars do not approve this. So in that sense, those people are really marginal in their interpretation of jihad. There is another discussion in Islam. One is about who can attack, you can attack in jihad, so those groups went extreme. Another discussion was about whether jihad is only defensive or can it be aggressive. Like, do you do jihad only to defend yourself when you're attacked? Everybody accepts that in Islam. Like, if your country is under attack, you can defend yourself. That is every Muslim accepts this, basically. But also in early Islam, permission was given to aggressive or jihad, which we call conquest. Muslims with the sword went from Spain to India. It was a conquest, and they fought the armies, and they did not force people to convert into Islam, but they dominated the land, right? That is another dispute, and I agree with the minority opinion, which says what the Quran allowed was actually only defensive jihad, but early Muslims needed to expand. That's what empires did at the time. So at the service of political power, a more aggressive, conquest-based jihad doctrine developed. And that had, that had about abrogation of certain verses in the Quran. Because there's one verse which says, fight in the name of God against those who attacked you in the first place. So verses like that in the Quran suggest that jihad is defensive. But early jurists thought that there's another verse about fighting the unbelievers unconditionally, so they thought that verse overrides this. And they made a conquest kind of doctrine. And it was at the service of the Umayyad Empire, who doesn't want to have conquest in the medieval era? I mean, that's what empires, and the thing is, it was not criticized at the time by Human Rights Watch or anything. I mean, that was the world in which we lived in, right? I mean, Mongols, and it was a world of empires. So Islam took the form of an empire. And I think we should detach that today and re-articulate Islam as a faith based on, free choice and conscience, and not any power. And again, many Muslims already agree with this, but some don't, and that's
I
our
don't want to
problem.
use this word, but I don't want to leave it like, so I should, in my argument, say, yeah, there's a connection.
Yeah, but it has to be put very carefully, because I also see people, you see all Muslims are terrorists. Well, no, not. I mean, that is the wrongest thing to say. But the people who do terrorism in the name of Islam, they are very marginal, but yes, they're not totally unconnected to the idea. They are using some of those arguments that we have to face and challenge and refute. That's yes, sir.
I'm Bhutan Shambayaryan, a professor of political science here.
Hoş bulduk. Are you Turkish?
I'm at the limit of my Turkish now.
Okay, that's
But I have a question. So, great, reform is a great thing. I would argue that Islam has gone through reform for 14 centuries, since there is no hierarchy, and at least for the past couple of centuries. But does that necessarily mean that the process of reform is peaceful? Can you argue that the violence that we see now and the debates that are taking place, and these debates are taking place, both the people who arrested you and the people who invited you to Malaysia were Muslims?
yeah.
But reformation is not necessarily a peaceful process. And so is it what you're seeing now, is it like a side effect of the reforms?
Mm-hmm.
And is that going on? My second question to you is that you mentioned, for example, the Western civilization, equality before law, and all of that. So if you look at you gave the example of the Ottoman Empire and how in the 19th century the reforms eliminated the Milad system, the different religious, the different levels of religion.